Barbie? The Admiral laughed, loud enough for 400 people to hear. I told my XO this can't be Iron Widow. This is Barbie. Nobody laughed longer than she did, because 40 minutes later, 2 armed men in stolen uniforms breached the arms locker, because she moved before security even reached the door, because a fire extinguisher and a pair of desk scissors were all it took to put 2 trained operatives on the ground, and every camera on base caught it. By nightfall, the Admiral wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at a single word buried in a file he thought he'd destroyed 6 years ago, a name he'd signed a death certificate for, a woman standing in front of him, very much alive, asking one question he'd spent 6 years praying nobody would ever ask again. What did you do to my father? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Coffee was cold, again. Wren Sutherland didn't mind. Cold coffee was a kind of discipline, a small daily reminder that comfort was optional and attention was not. She drank it anyway, standing at the window of a beige cubicle on the 3rd floor of the Logistics and Personnel Building at Naval Support Facility Ashcombe, Virginia, watching the sun climb over a parking lot full of government sedans. 6 years she had stood at this window. 6 years of the same gray carpet. 6 years of the same fluorescent hum overhead, the kind of hum that got into your teeth if you let it. She never let it. Because that was the trick. That was the whole trick of disappearing. You didn't vanish by hiding. You vanished by becoming boring, by becoming furniture, by becoming the kind of woman men looked past on their way to someone more interesting. 27 years old, 5'3" in boots, hair the color of wheat in October, always pulled back so tight it made her scalp ache by noon, blue eyes that most people described as pretty and never once described as watchful. That was fine. That was the point. She filed requisition forms. She processed leave requests. She made coffee for men twice her rank, who called her sweetheart without malice and without thought, the way you'd call a coffee machine reliable. She smiled when it was expected. She said, "Yes, sir, and, of course, sir, and I'll have that on your desk by 1400, sir." And every single night, alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, 11 minutes from the base, she field-stripped a pistol she wasn't supposed to own and reassembled it in the dark. Because her hands needed to remember. Because some things you didn't let yourself forget, even when forgetting would have been so much easier. Her father used to say that muscle memory was the only kind of memory that never lied to you. Her father used to say a lot of things. She didn't let herself finish that thought. Not this morning. Not with coffee going cold in her hand and a stack of transport manifests waiting on her desk and Petty Officer Danny Ruiz 2 cubicles over, humming a country song off-key like the world, was a simple, uncomplicated place. It wasn't. She knew that better than almost anyone alive. But you couldn't let people see you knowing it. That was the first rule. The only rule that had kept her breathing for 6 years. She sat down. She opened the file. She began to type. Line items. Pallet counts. A shipment of medical supplies delayed out of Norfolk because somebody had transposed 2 digits on a manifest number. She fixed it in 90 seconds. Nobody would ever know it had been wrong. Nobody would ever know she'd caught it either, because that was the shape of her whole existence, now small corrections. Invisible hands. A woman who kept the machine running smoothly and never once got credit for the parts that would have broken without her. There had been a time once when the things she fixed had bodies attached to them, when the corrections she made kept people breathing instead of keeping paperwork tidy. She didn't let herself think about that either. Not this morning. Across the row of cubicles, Danny Ruiz was still humming, tapping a pen against his desk in time with a song only he could hear. He caught her eye and grinned, easy and unbothered, the way 24-year-olds grinned when the worst thing that had ever happened to them was a bad breakup or a failed PT test. "You ever gonna tell me what you did before this?" he asked. Not for the first time. He asked some version of that question at least once a month, the way some people asked about the weather, mostly out of habit, not really expecting an answer. "Filed paperwork," Wren said. "Somewhere else. Real specific. I'm a specific person." He laughed, went back to his own screen. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and went back to hers. This was the rhythm. This had been the rhythm for 6 years, and she had learned to live inside it, the way you learned to live inside a smaller apartment than you wanted. Not comfortably, exactly, but functionally. You stopped noticing the walls. You stopped reaching for space that wasn't there. Until, occasionally, something reminded you the walls existed at all. The ceremony was scheduled for 1100 hours, out on the parade ground, under a sky so blue and so wide it looked almost fake, like something painted onto a movie set for a war film that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be tragic or triumphant. Wren hadn't wanted to go. She never wanted to go to these things. Base ceremonies meant crowds, and crowds meant cameras, and cameras meant the tiny possibility infinitesimal, she told herself. Infinitesimal, that somewhere out there, someone who remembered a different version of her face might be scrolling through a local news clip and pause, might frown, might look twice. But attendance wasn't optional for support staff. Rear Admiral Marcus Halloway liked a full audience when he spoke. He liked the applause to sound like a wave instead of a ripple. She walked out with the rest of the logistics floor, folders tucked under one arm, because Chief Petty Officer Alvarez had asked her to bring updated readiness numbers in case anyone wanted them after, and she found her place in the third row, arms folded, sun hot on the back of her neck. Around her the crowd settled into the low murmur of 400 people, pretending to be more interested than they were. Somewhere behind her, 2 sailors were quietly arguing about a football score. Somewhere ahead, a toddler, one of the family members, present for the recognition of a longtime civilian contractor, shrieked with delight at something only toddlers found delightful, and half the crowd smiled without meaning to. It was, Wren thought, a very ordinary morning. The kind of morning that never announced itself as the last ordinary morning of anything. Halloway took the podium in his dress whites, silver stars catching the light like they'd been polished specifically to blind people, and Wren watched him work the crowd with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had never once in his career had to disappear to survive a mistake. He was good at this part. She'd give him that. Good at the cadence of command, the practiced pauses, the way he let his eyes sweep the crowd like he was memorizing every face for a Christmas card. Because readiness, he was saying, isn't a slogan. It's a promise. It's what we owe the people who trust us to keep this country's shoulders squared against whatever comes next. Scattered applause. A few claps that meant it. A lot that were just reflex. Then he did the thing he liked to do. He called out names. Not just the officers being recognized. Support staff, too. Every now and then. Because it played well. Because it made him look like a man who saw everyone. Who forgot no one. And I want to give a shout-out, he said, grinning, now, warming up, to the finest paperwork this base has ever produced. Manifest accuracy, 98%, 6 years running. That's Miss Sutherland back there. Where are you, Sutherland? There she is. Every head in the third row turned. Wren felt her stomach drop the way it used to drop on the rope descent out of the back of a helicopter at 2,000 feet, that same sick lurch. Except this time there was no chute, no line, nowhere to land except right here, right now, in front of 400 people. She lifted a hand. Small wave. Practiced smile. Nothing to see. Halloway wasn't done. Funny thing, he said, and he was looking around now, playing to the crowd. I was going through some old transfer files last week. Don't ask me why, boredom, I guess. Or maybe I just like torturing myself with paperwork, same as the rest of you. And I found this old personnel tag. Some kind of leftover designation from a contract to rotation. Must have been a clerical thing, said Iron Widow. He laughed. An easy, booming laugh, the kind that invited everyone else to laugh with him. Iron Widow. He shook his head. I don't know who thought that one up. Some intern with too much imagination, probably. I told my ex so, I said. Whoever this is, she sounds terrifying. Then I pulled the photo and it's, he gestured, still grinning. It's Sutherland, little thing back there who brings me my coffee reports. I said, that's not Iron Widow. That's Barbie. The laugh that went through the crowd was warm. Affectionate even. Nobody meant harm by it. That was the worst part, nobody in that crowd had any idea they were laughing at a ghost. Wren kept her hand raised in its small wave, kept the smile bolted to her face like a fixture. Because inside something old and cold had just opened one eye. Iron Widow. That name hadn't existed on paper in 6 years. She'd watched it get burned, personally. Watched the folder go into a shredder in a room with no windows. Watched a man she'd trusted tell her that name was dead now, along with everyone who'd carried it before her. And here it was, coming out of Marcus Halloway's mouth like a punchline, like a joke he'd stumbled onto in a filing cabinet, like it meant nothing. She kept smiling. She kept waving. Because that was the job. That had always been the job. But somewhere behind her ribs, a clock she thought she'd stopped 6 years ago started ticking again. The ceremony went on. Halloway moved to the next name, the next award, and the crowd's attention slid away from her the way it always did, easily, without effort, exactly the way she needed it to. She stood there in the third row with her folders under her arm and let the rest of the ceremony wash past her, hearing none of it, her mind already somewhere else, entirely somewhere cold, somewhere years and years back, in a place she'd spent 6 years teaching herself not to visit, because you didn't accidentally know a designation like that, because somebody had pulled a file that should not have existed anymore, in a system that should not have been able to produce it, and handed it to a man for laughs, which meant the file wasn't as dead as she'd been promised, which meant somebody, somewhere, had made a mistake, or a choice. She didn't know which possibility frightened her more. Danny Ruiz caught up to her in the hallway afterward, jogging a little to close the distance, grinning like he'd just watched something delightful. "Barbie," he said, "I'm never calling you Sutherland again. Don't. No, come on, it's good. It's a good bit." "The Admiral's got jts. He's got something," Wren said and kept walking. Danny fell into step beside her. 24 years old. Good kid. Genuinely good. Not performing it. The kind of good that came from never having had a reason not to be. He'd been at Ashcombe 8 months, fresh off a training pipeline, still excited by things that had long since stopped being exciting, to Wren new equipment smell, the taste of the good coffee in the officer's lounge, the idea that his job mattered. It did matter. She wasn't being cruel about it, even in her own head. It was just that his version of mattering and her version of mattering used to live in very different buildings. "You know," Danny said, "for a paperwork gal, you sure don't laugh much." "I laugh. When things are funny." He grinned wider. "That wasn't funny to you?" She stopped walking, turned, looked at him properly for the first time that morning, and something in her face must have shifted, because his grin faltered a little, uncertain now, like he'd walked into a room and found the temperature different than he expected. "It was a joke," Wren said evenly. "Jokes are fine." "Okay," Danny said, slower now. "Okay, sure." She started walking again. He didn't follow this time. Good instincts, that kid, she thought. Better than he knows. Behind her, she heard him mutter something to another sailor passing by, something about how Sutherland had gotten weird all of a sudden, and she let it go because there was nothing to be gained from correcting him, nothing to be gained from explaining that weird was in fact the least accurate word available for what had just happened inside her chest. She badged back into the logistics building, sat at her desk, opened her email, because that was what a person did. That was the performance. Keep moving, keep typing, keep being exactly as boring as the last 6 years had required. But her eyes kept drifting to the small clock in the corner of her monitor. 1042, 1043, 1047. Somewhere in this base, in some server she had no access to anymore, a designation with her face attached to it had resurfaced, and she had no way of knowing. Not yet, not until she found out more, whether that resurfacing was an accident or an invitation. That night she didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark, in an apartment with government beige walls and a single framed photograph on the dresser, her and her father, a lake somewhere in the Blue Ridge, both of them squinting into a sun that had set 15 years ago and never quite come back up in her chest the same way since, and she stared at the ceiling and let the name sit in her mouth like a stone. Iron Widow. Her father had given her that name. Not officially. Officially, names like that came down through a chain of command, got assigned by someone with a clipboard who'd never fired a weapon outside a range. But her father had said it first, years before it ever went on paper, sitting across a kitchen table from her, with a cup of black coffee, and an expression she hadn't understood until much later was pride, trying very hard not to look like fear. Because you'll bury them all and walk away clean, he'd said. Because that's what a widow does. She survives what should have killed her, and she doesn't apologize for it. He'd meant it as a compliment. It had taken her years to stop hearing it as a prophecy. She rolled onto her side, reached under the mattress, out of pure old habit, and felt the flat weight of the pistol case there, untouched tonight, because tonight she didn't need to strip it down to remember her hands. Tonight her hands remembered everything on their own, because Holloway had said the name out loud, which meant somewhere, in some digital archive, a file with her real designation had resurfaced, which meant somebody at some point hadn't finished the job of burying it, which meant 6 years of careful, patient, suffocating invisibility might have just sprung a leak she couldn't see the size of yet. Until she knew how deep that leak went, she couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't dig, couldn't do anything except lie here in the dark and count her own heartbeat like it was a countdown clock she didn't control. So she breathed. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Her father's rhythm, learned on a hillside in conditions she didn't let herself remember in detail anymore, because detail was a door, and behind that door was a version of grief that had teeth. She thought about calling someone. There wasn't anyone left to call. That was the arithmetic of the life she'd built. Every number that used to matter had been disconnected, reassigned, or buried, and the 2 people from the old world she still trusted with anything real hadn't heard her real voice in 6 years either. Because contact was how you got found. Because silence, brutal and total, had been the price of staying alive. She thought about her mother, and 3 states away, remarried now, a woman who believed her daughter worked a quiet government desk job and grieved a husband whose body had never come home. Wren had let her believe it, had visited twice a year, careful and smiling and empty in all the ways that mattered, because giving her mother the truth would only have handed her a second grief to carry, and one was already more than enough. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she finally slept. She dreamed, as she always did, of snow, of a ridgeline, of a radio going silent at the exact moment it should have said her name. 6 years earlier, the mountains outside Colville Ridge, a designation that existed on no public map, a training and staging corridor the government had quietly carved out of federal timberland for a program that officially didn't exist, held cold like a grudge. Wren remembered that most clearly, remembered it more clearly than she remembered most of that year. The way the cold there didn't feel like weather. It felt personal. She was 21. She had been in the program 18 months, the youngest operator ever fast-tracked through cadre selection, and she still flinched sometimes at the sound of her own call sign coming over a radio, because some part of her, some stubborn, girlish, unerased part still, expected someone to ask for her father instead. Naval Sutherland. 26 years a Marine. 2 decades of it spent in places whose names never made the news, doing work that never made the after-action reports look the way the actual reports would have. By the time Wren enlisted, her father was already something close to myth, inside a very small, very quiet world. The man who could put a round through a keyhole at 1,100 meters in a crosswind. The man 3 different commanding officers had tried and failed to talk into a desk job. The man who trained his own daughter, not because he wanted her in that life, but because he knew, better than anyone, that she was going to end up there with or without him, and he'd be damned if she went in unprepared. He never called it training. He called it Sunday. Sunday mornings, from the time she was 9 years old, a rifle range behind the property line nobody else knew existed, a father who counted her breaths out loud until she learned to count them herself, a mother's voice from the porch calling them in for lunch that always went cold, because neither of them wanted to stop. She remembered the first time he let her dry fire at a target 400 yards out, remembered how her arms shook from the weight of a rifle too big for a 9-year-old frame, remembered him kneeling behind her, not touching the weapon, just his voice, low and patient. Not your eyes. Your breath. The eyes lie, the breath doesn't. She remembered turning 12 and asking him once why he never took her brothers hunting the way other fathers took their sons. She didn't have brothers. That had been the joke, and he'd laughed. Actually laughed. One of the rare full laughs she got out of him, and said, "Because I don't have sons, Wren. I have you, and you're better than any son I could have made up." She remembered being 16 and understanding, for the first time, what those Sunday mornings had actually been building toward. Not a hobby, not a bonding ritual, a preparation. Her father had looked at the world with a soldier's clarity and understood, long before she did, that a daughter with her particular gifts would eventually be asked to use them, whether she volunteered for it or the world simply came looking. By the time she was 21 and standing on a ridge in Colville, with frost forming on her eyelashes, she didn't need him counting anymore. She'd absorbed his rhythm so completely it had become her own pulse. The program itself had no name that meant anything outside its own walls. A joint interagency initiative, deniable by design, drawing from the deepest and quietest wells of military and intelligence talent to run operations too politically toxic for any conventional unit to touch. 6 operators to a cell, rotating designations instead of names. A commanding structure so compartmentalized that most of the operators never learned who, above a certain level, was actually giving the orders. Her father led the sniper element of Cell 4. She was his spotter. And increasingly, though nobody on paper would ever admit it, something closer to a second shooter, because 6 years of Sunday mornings had made her good enough that keeping her in a support role felt, to both of them, like a formality neither believed in anymore. She remembered the night before Winter Ferry with unusual clarity, clearer than she remembered most of the mission itself, because it was the last ordinary night, and some part of her must have known it. Must have been paying closer attention than usual, without knowing why. Her father cleaning his rifle in the dim light of their staging tent, humming something tuneless under his breath. Her own hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, because that had already become her habit, even then. Drink it anyway. Comfort is optional. "You scared?" she'd asked him. 21 years old, and still, in some small corner of herself, needing to ask her father that question the way she had at 9. He hadn't looked up from the rifle. "Every time," he said. "Anybody tells you different, they're lying or they're stupid, and either way you don't want them on your left flank. Then how do you do it?" He'd looked at her then. Really looked, the way he used to look at her across the kitchen table, with pride trying not to look like fear. "You do it anyway," he said. "That's the whole trick. Not being unafraid. Doing it anyway." She hadn't understood, that night, how much weight those words would end up carrying for her alone, 6 years later, in a hallway with a fire extinguisher in her hands and a stranger's hand at her throat. Winter Ferry wasn't its real name. Nothing in that world had its real name. That was the first and last rule of it. Officially, it was a joint interagency asset recovery operation. Deniable. Off the books. 6 operators inserted to extract a compromised intelligence source before a hostile private military contractor could get to him first. The source codenamed Lantern, a man whose actual identity Wren never learned and never asked about, because asking about things above your clearance was how you got yourself quietly reassigned. Had spent 18 months feeding information out of a program nobody in Cell 4 fully understood, and the window to pull him out before his cover collapsed entirely had shrunk, in the space of 1 week, from a month to 72 hours. Unofficially, it was the kind of mission that existed, because someone several pay grades above anyone on the ground had decided the political cost of it going wrong was smaller than the political cost of not trying. The insertion went smoothly. That was the part that still haunted her most. Some nights, how smoothly it went, how ordinary the first 4 hours felt, how nothing in the wind or the terrain or the quality of the silence gave any warning of what was coming. She and her father took the high ground, a rock outcropping 1,100 meters from the extraction point, and settled into the long, patient stillness that sniper overwatch demanded, breathing in the same 4-count rhythm he'd taught her on a hillside a decade earlier. Below them, in the dark, 4 other operators moved toward the safe house where Lantern was supposedly waiting. The extraction went sideways at 340 hours. Wren didn't let herself replay all of it very often, because replaying it in full detail cost her sleep for days afterward, but certain pieces of it never left, no matter how many years she stacked on top of them. The radio chatter that went from calm to clipped to silent within 90 seconds. Her father's voice, steady even then, giving her the order to hold position on the overwatch while he moved down to cover the extraction team's collapsing perimeter. Contact, multiple hostiles. This wasn't in the brief, that was Reyes. The team's point man, his voice climbing an octave in the space of 4 words. Widow, hold position. Her father's voice, calm as a man discussing the weather, cutting through the chaos on the channel. I'm going down to cover the collapse. You keep eyes on the ridge. Nobody flanks us from the east while I'm moving. Copy, she'd said. Her voice hadn't shaken. She was proud of that. Later, in the strange, useless way you're proud of small things after the larger thing has already broken you. Her voice hadn't shaken, even as her whole body had gone cold, with a fear she wouldn't let herself name. The 2 words he said right before he went, dark stay, put delivered in the same tone he used to use for past the salt, because that was who he was, a man who didn't let his voice know what his body already suspected. And then nothing. For 6 hours, nothing. Static where a radio check should have been. Wren lying prone on frozen granite, with a rifle she couldn't fire because she had no target, no comms, no confirmation of anything except the growing, glacial certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong below her position. She remembered the moment the sky started to lighten, gray creeping in at the edges of the ridge, and how each new degree of visibility felt like a countdown to a piece of information she didn't want. She remembered scanning the valley below, through her scope for the 100th time, looking for any sign of movement, any confirmation of anything, and finding only stillness. Terrible, complete stillness. She remembered breaking protocol. The first and only time in 18 months she'd broken protocol, and moving down off the ridge without orders, without comms confirmation. Because staying put had stopped being a choice she could live with somewhere around hour 4. She remembered what she found at the safe house. She didn't let herself finish that memory. Not tonight. Not ever, if she could help it. Some doors, once you opened them all the way, didn't close again the same. When the recovery team finally reached her position at first light, they told her the extraction team had been ambushed. Compromised from the inside, they said. A leak in the chain, they said. Her father and 3 others were listed killed in action. Bodies unrecoverable due to operational conditions. The whole event immediately classified into a drawer so deep it might as well have not happened. Nobody used the word betrayed. Not officially. But Wren had heard the word in the silences around the official language, in the way certain people avoided her eyes during the debrief, in the way the operation's name got scrubbed from every system within 72 hours like the government itself. Was embarrassed to have its fingerprints anywhere near it. She was told, in a windowless room, by a man whose name she'd been ordered to forget, that the program itself was being dissolved, that her identity, her designation, everything that had made her Iron Widow, was being sealed, that the safest thing, the only thing she could do now was disappear into a life boring enough that nobody looking for loose ends would ever think to look at her twice. She had asked in that room whether anyone had looked for her father's body. The man had not answered. She had asked whether anyone was going to find out who leaked the operation. The man had not answered that either, so she'd done the only thing left to do. She built herself a new life out of beige carpet and cold coffee, and a face nobody remembered twice, and she waited. 6 years of waiting, patient as frost, for something to crack the silence open. She just hadn't expected the crack to come from a man laughing at a name on a parade ground. Morning came the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had kept her awake. Wren showered, dressed, pulled her hair back until her scalp protested, and drove to the base with the radio off, because that morning she didn't trust her own concentration around music, around anything that might loosen the grip she was keeping on herself. The base looked the way it always looked. Gray buildings, gray sky threatening rain later, sailors and Marines moving in the unhurried, purposeful current of a place that ran on routine. Nothing about the morning announced itself as the day everything would change. That was, she would think much later, exactly the kind of morning her father had always warned her about, the ones that lied to you with their ordinariness. She badged into the logistics building at 7:15, 12 minutes before her actual start time, because old discipline didn't care what her cover job required. She made coffee. She let it go cold, the way she always did, a small private ritual nobody else understood the meaning of. Chief Alvarez stopped by her desk at 8:30 with a stack of forms and an offhand comment about the ceremony, something about how the Admiral sure did love the sound of his own voice. And Wren managed something close to a laugh, close enough that Alvarez didn't notice anything was wrong, and that felt, in its own small way, like a victory. The mask was still holding. Barely. At 900 the fire alarm went off. Not the drill klaxon. Not the two-tone pattern everyone on base had memorized from a dozen scheduled evacuations a year. This was different, continuous, jarring, wrong in a way her body recognized a full second before her conscious mind caught up. Around her, people reacted the way people reacted to fire alarms. Mild annoyance, gathering of bags and jackets, the low grumble of interrupted routine. Danny Ruiz stood up 2 cubicles over, stretching unbothered. "Bet you $5 it's a burned bagel in the break room," he said. Wren wasn't listening to him, because underneath the alarm, underneath the low hum of 200 confused people shuffling toward exits, she'd heard something else. Something small and precise and entirely wrong for a Tuesday morning on a support base. A sound her body had catalogued years ago and never fully unlearned. Suppressed weapons discharge. 2 rounds. Close. Very close. Her hands went cold in the way they used to go cold before a mission, a sensation she hadn't felt in 6 years and had somehow, impossibly, missed. "Danny," she said, "get everyone out the west stairwell now." "What? Why the west?" "Because the east exit runs past the arms locker," she said, already moving, already shedding the careful, small, unremarkable version of herself, like a coat she'd finally outgrown. "Go now. Don't argue with me." Something in her voice must have carried more weight than a woman who processed transport manifests should ever have been able to summon, because Danny didn't argue. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, confused, startled, already a little afraid, and then he did what she said. Wren didn't wait to see it through. She was already moving the other way, toward the sound, toward the arms locker, toward exactly the kind of danger 6 years of discipline had trained her to walk toward instead of away from, because some instincts didn't care how long you'd tried to bury them. Her mind, moving fast now, cold and clean and entirely unlike the fog of the last 2 sleepless nights, ran the geometry of the building, without her having to think about it. Arms locker, west corridor, single access point, 1 camera blind spot near the utility closet that every maintenance worker on base knew about because it was where people snuck cigarettes. If someone wanted in, without being seen on the primary feed, that was the door. Which meant whoever this was had done their homework. Which meant this wasn't random. Which meant she almost stopped walking at the thought, almost let it slow her down before she forced it aside, because there would be time to be afraid later. This was not the time, which meant the timing of this, one day after a name she'd buried got said out loud on a parade ground, was not a coincidence any rational person should be willing to accept. The corridor outside the arms locker was empty when she reached it, which told her more than a crowd would have. Empty meant controlled, meant someone had cleared it deliberately, quickly, professionally. She had nothing on her. No sidearm, no blade beyond the small multi-tool she kept clipped inside her jacket out of habit rather than necessity. No comms, nothing except a pair of scissors from her desk drawer that she'd grabbed without fully deciding to, and a fire extinguisher bolted to the wall 6 feet away. It would have to be enough. It had been enough before, in worse places, with less. She heard voices ahead, low, controlled, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who'd rehearsed this. 2 men, she judged, maybe 3. Dressed, she caught a glimpse through the gap. In a half-open door-in base maintenance coveralls, badges clipped to their chests that would pass a glance from anyone not looking closely enough to notice the badge numbers didn't match the base's current rotation. Contractors, or something dressed up to look like contractors. Either way, not here to fix a boiler. Her mind, despite everything, despite 6 years of trying to starve this exact kind of thinking out of herself, snapped into a rhythm she recognized instantly. Assess, isolate, neutralize. Her father's voice, underneath her own thoughts, steady as ever. Breathe in for 4. You already know what to do. You've always known what to do. She moved. The first man never saw her coming, because she came low and fast, through the gap in the door, using the fire extinguisher as a battering weight against the back of his knee before he'd fully registered a sound behind him. He went down hard, and she was already past him, already closing the distance to the second man before he could fully turn. He was bigger, faster than his size suggested. He got a hand up in time to block the first strike, and for one long, ugly second they grappled in the narrow hallway, close enough that she could smell gun oil and adrenaline sweat on him, close enough to feel the exact moment he underestimated her because of her size, the way men like this always underestimated her, right up until the moment it cost them, because that was the whole design of her, wasn't it? Small hands, soft face, a body built by genetics to be dismissed on sight, and a decade of Sunday mornings that had turned every one of those assumptions into a weapon nobody saw coming until it was already too late to matter. He got a hand around her collar. She let him have it for exactly half a second, using his own grip as leverage, driving her weight down and sideways in a motion so old and so drilled into her, it didn't feel like thinking at all. It felt like breathing, and he stumbled, off balance, giving her the half-step of space she needed. She drove the scissors, not to kill. She registered that decision in some cold, clinical corner of her mind even as her body moved, but to disable, into the meat of his forearm. And when he screamed and recoiled, she used the extinguisher again. Full weight, full commitment, the way her father had taught her to commit to a strike or not throw it at all. He went down. A third voice, from deeper in the arms locker, shouted something in a language she registered but didn't have time to place. And then there were footsteps, retreating, fast, someone deciding the operation had already failed and cutting losses. Wren didn't chase. Chasing was how you got shot from an angle you hadn't cleared. Instead, she checked the 2 men on the ground, both breathing, both disabled, both very clearly professionals whose training had simply, catastrophically, not accounted for a 5'3" logistic clerk who moved like something out of a nightmare they hadn't been briefed on, and she pulled the fire alarm's manual override to keep the corridor sealed, and she waited, breathing hard, hands shaking now that there was nothing left to fight, for base security to arrive. They arrived in under 2 minutes. 4 of them, weapons drawn, shouting instructions she complied with immediately. Hands up. Calm voice, the voice of someone who understood exactly how this looked and exactly how fast it could go wrong if she gave them any reason to see her as a threat instead of whatever she actually was. It was only later, standing against the wall with her hands zip-tied in front of her as a formality nobody seemed to fully believe in, watching medics work on the 2 men she'd put down, that she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done. Because there was no version of this where Wren Sutherland, the logistics clerk, explained away what had just happened in that hallway. The mask was off. Whatever came next, there was no putting it back on. They took her to a conference room on the second floor of the security building. Gray walls, gray table, the particular institutional silence of a room built for interviews nobody enjoyed conducting. She sat with her hands finally free, a paper cup of water in front of her that she hadn't touched, and she watched through the window as base personnel filed past outside, most of them still not aware anything had happened beyond a fire alarm and an unusually long delay getting back to their desks. 2 investigators sat across from her. A woman, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, introduced herself as Special Agent Diane Wexler out of NCIS. A man beside her, younger, silent, taking notes on a laptop with the focused blankness of someone whose job was to record and not react. "Walk me through it again," Wexler said. "Not unkind, just precise." Wren did. She kept the account clean, factual, stripped of anything that would raise more questions than it answered. Heard the alarm. Heard something under the alarm. Went to investigate instead of evacuating. Encountered 2 individuals in maintenance uniforms behaving inconsistently with the alarm protocol. Neutralized the threat using available objects. Waited for security. Wexler studied at her for a long moment after she finished. The kind of look that wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't buying the simplicity of the story either. "You understand," Wexler said slowly, "that what you just described isn't really a thing untrained personnel do. 2 armed men. Professional-grade equipment. We're finding out-suppressed weapons. Breach tools. A van parked outside the west perimeter with plates that don't exist in any registry. And you took both of them down with a fire extinguisher and a pair of desk scissors." "I got lucky," Wren said. "You didn't get lucky," Wexler said. "Lucky people freeze. Lucky people run the wrong direction. What you did was textbook. Precise. Economical. I've seen combatives instructors move less cleanly than what's on the hallway camera." Wren said nothing. "So here's where we are," Wexler continued, sliding a folder across the table, not opening it yet, just letting it sit there, a small gray weight between them. "We ran your personnel file the second this happened. Standard procedure. Except your personnel file, Miss Sutherland, is thinner than a support clerk's file has any right to be. No prior duty stations before Ashcombe. No training record before 6 years ago. It's like you appeared out of thin air at 21 years old with a security clearance. Nobody in this building has the authority to have granted you." The room felt very small suddenly. Very quiet, except for the soft hum of the overhead lights, the same hum that had gotten into her teeth for 6 years and that she'd never once let herself react to. "And then," Wexler said, opening the folder now, turning it so Wren could see, "my supervisor pulls a flag on your file that came down not from us, from somewhere well above us. A designation that got attached to an old contractor rotation record 6 years ago and never fully purged, no matter how many times someone apparently tried." Wren looked down at the single word on the page in front of her, printed in plain government type, stripped of all the weight it had once carried, and somehow, impossibly, carrying every bit of it anyway. "Iron Widow. Somebody upstairs," Wexler said quietly, "is about to have a very bad morning finding out that name's still walking around on 2 legs. As if summoned by the sentence itself. The man in the corner, monitoring the laptop, looked up, phone buzzing against the table, and glanced at Wexler with an expression that said, unmistakably, "Speak of the devil." "Ma'am," he said, "you're going to want to take this." Wexler stepped out. Wren sat alone in the gray room, with the folder still open in front of her, her own old name staring back up at her, and for one strange, suspended moment, she found herself thinking not of danger, not of what came next, but of her father's voice at a kitchen table years ago, saying it like a compliment, "Because you'll bury them all and walk away clean." She hadn't buried them all. Not really. She'd only buried herself, and even that, apparently, hadn't taken. Through the frosted glass of the door, she could hear Wexler's voice rising, sharp, incredulous, arguing with someone on the other end of the line, about jurisdiction, about authority, about a case that had just gotten yanked out from under her by someone with stars on their shoulder. The door opened. The bad morning arrived 40 minutes later, in the form of Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway, striding into the security building with the particular urgency of a man who'd just been pulled out of a meeting by a phone call he hadn't wanted to take. Wren heard him before she saw him, heard the raised voice down the corridor, heard Wexler's calmer counterpoint, heard the specific cadence of a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence and discovering, in real time, that this room wasn't going to. Then the conference room door opened, and Holloway stepped inside, and Wren watched something happen to his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. He looked at her. Really looked. For what she suspected was the first time in 6 years, not the polite, unseeing glance of a commanding officer acknowledging support staff, but a full, searching, disbelieving look. The look of a man trying to reconcile two images that his mind was refusing to merge. "Sutherland," he said. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "Sutherland, sir," Wren said, because even now, even with the mask cracked wide open, some part of her still reached for the old script. Holloway didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table, one hand braced against the back of a chair like he needed the support, and Wren watched the folder in front of her, the single printed word, Iron Widow, finally register in his eyes. "That's not possible," he said. "Sir," Wexler said, half a question, sensing something happening in the room that had nothing to do with her investigation. Holloway didn't answer her. He was still looking at Wren, and his face had gone the particular gray color of a man, discovering that a debt he'd assumed permanently unpayable had just walked back into his life, wearing a government badge and a support staff lanyard. 6 years, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, betraying something underneath the polish, underneath the parade ground grin from yesterday morning. 6 years I signed the file that closed that program. 6 years I told myself. Huh. He stopped, pressed his lips together, looked, for one unguarded second, like a much older man than the one who'd stood on the podium yesterday, cracking jokes about Barbie dolls. "Told yourself what?" Wren said. Quiet, level, but underneath the levelness, something sharpening, something 6 years in the making, finally finding its edge. That everyone from Winter Ferry was dead? That it was clean? That there was nobody left who'd remember exactly whose signature authorized that extraction window? The room went very still. Wexler looked between them, sharp-eyed investigator instincts clearly working overtime, clearly understanding that whatever she'd walked into was several tiers above the incident report she'd been prepared to file. "I think," Wexler said carefully, "I need to step out for a moment." "Sit down, Agent Wexler," Holloway said, not looking at her, still looking at Wren. "Because in about 30 seconds, this stops being your case anyway. Sir, with respect, I have 2 men in custody who tried to breach an arms locker on a United States naval facility, and I have a support staffer who apparently used to carry a classified operational designation that this base's own systems have no record of." I said, "Sit down." Holloway's voice cracked like a whip, all the parade ground warmth gone out of it in an instant, and for the first time, Wren saw the version of him that had made rank, the version underneath the grin, the version capable of signing off on an operation that got 4 people killed and calling it acceptable risk. Wexler sat, slowly watched. Holloway finally pulled out the chair he'd been bracing against and lowered himself into it, and up close, in the gray light of that room, Wren could see 6 years had not been kind to him either, not really. The lines around his eyes deeper than a man his age should carry, the particular tired weight of someone who'd built a career on top of a decision he'd never fully made peace with. "You're supposed to be dead," he said, quietly, almost gently. "Both of you." That's what the file said. "Killed in action, bodies unrecoverable." "Both of us," Wren repeated. Her voice had gone very careful now, very controlled, the voice of someone approaching a live wire with bare hands because there was no other way to reach what was on the other side of it. "You said, both of us." Holloway's eyes flicked down to the table, away from her. The oldest tell in the world, and coming from him, in this room, it landed like a physical blow. "Sir." Wren leaned forward, and every trace of the small, unremarkable clerk who'd filed paperwork for 6 years was gone from her voice now, burned away, replaced by something that had been waiting a very long time to speak. "What do you know about my father?" Holloway didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, the long, terrible, 6 years in the making silence, Wren felt the last piece of the careful, patient, disappearing life she'd built for herself come apart in her hands like wet paper, because a man who had nothing to hide would have answered immediately. A man who had nothing to hide wouldn't have looked like he'd just seen a headstone stand up and start walking toward him. "We need to talk," Holloway finally said. "Not here." Not with a glance at Wexler, apologetic, final, not with an open investigation file attached to it. "You don't get to decide that," Wren said. "Miss Sutherland, you don't get to decide that," she said again, and this time her voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't do any of the things a voice was supposed to do when 6 years of carefully buried grief finally cracked its way to the surface. It went cold instead, cold and flat and precise, the exact tone her father used to use in the field when a situation had stopped being negotiable. "You had 6 years, Admiral. 6 years to tell someone the truth. And instead, I got a name whispered on a parade ground like a punchline, and 2 men with suppressed weapons trying to break into an arms locker 40 minutes later. And I don't believe for 1 second those 2 things aren't connected." Holloway's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might actually deny it, might reach for the old comfortable authority of rank and simply order the conversation closed. Instead, something in him seemed to buckle. Some structural weight he'd been carrying quietly for 6 years finally exceeding what the frame could hold. "They're connected," he said, barely above a whisper. "God help me, Sutherland. They're connected." Wexler, still watching, still silent, made a small note on her laptop and did not look up, and Wren understood, in that moment, that whatever came next would happen in rooms far smaller and far more private than this one, in front of people whose names would never appear on any public record. "Then start talking," Wren said. "Because I've been waiting 6 years for a debrief nobody ever gave me, and Admiral, I am done waiting." Holloway closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering himself for something he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his own head, and never once believed he'd have to say out loud. "Not here," he said again, quieter this time, and there was something almost pleading in it now, something that had nothing to do with rank. "There are things about that night I can tell you, and there are things I genuinely don't know, things I've spent 6 years trying to find out myself and failing. But I promise you this much, right now, in front of a federal agent, because I owe you at least this much honesty after everything I've taken from you." He looked up, met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw something in his face that wasn't authority or grief, but something closer to fear. "Your father's file was never closed because he was confirmed dead. It was closed because I ordered it closed. Because keeping it open was going to get someone else killed, and I have spent 6 years telling myself that was the right call." The room seemed to tilt very slightly around her, the way the world used to tilt at altitude, right before the air got too thin to trust. "Are you telling me," Wren said, very slowly, very carefully, each word placed like a footstep on ice she wasn't sure would hold, "that you don't know if he's dead?" Holloway didn't answer. Not with words, but he didn't look away this time either. And in the space where his silence should have been a denial, Wren found instead something far worse, far more dangerous, far more capable of unmaking 6 years of careful, patient, grief-shaped peace than any confirmation could have been. Hope, cold, unwelcome, uninvited hope, arriving 6 years too late and asking her, in a grey conference room under fluorescent lights that had never once stopped humming, to start believing in something all over again. She sat very still, hands folded on the table in front of her, and looked at the man who held the answer to 6 years of unanswered radio silence, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Not relief. Something closer to the moment before a trigger breaks. The stillness right before everything changes. Outside the window, the bass continued its indifferent Tuesday rhythm engines starting. boots on pavement, the ordinary machinery of a world that had no idea it was about to be told the truth about something it had buried alongside 4 names on a wall nobody was allowed to visit. "Then you're going to tell me everything," Wren said. "Tonight. Every piece of it. Because if there is even the smallest chance my father is still alive somewhere, Admiral, I promise you, there is nothing left on this earth that is going to stop me from finding him." Holloway held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his face, some last vestige of the confident man who'd stood on a podium yesterday, laughing at a punchline he never understood, finally, quietly, gave way. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm afraid of." They released her at 1,800 hours. No charges. No formal statement beyond the one she'd already given, and even that, she suspected, was being quietly rerouted into a classification tier Agent Wexler would never be cleared to see again. Wexler herself had gone very quiet in the last hour of the afternoon, the sharp-eyed skepticism replaced by something more like caution, the particular caution of a professional who has just watched a case get lifted directly out of her hands by a chain of command she couldn't see the top of. "For what it's worth," Wexler said, walking her out through the security building's side entrance, away from the small knot of onlookers still lingering near the front. "Whatever this is, I hope you get your answers." "You don't believe that," Wren said. Not unkindly, just true. Wexler considered that for a moment. "I believe you're not who your file said you were," she said. "I believe 2 trained operatives just tried to breach a naval arms locker 40 minutes after a 2-star admiral said your old call sign out loud in front of 400 people. And I believe the Navy just took my case away so fast, the paperwork's still smoking." She paused at the door. "Whether you get your answers is a different question. In my experience, people who go looking for the kind of answers you're looking for don't always like what they find." "I know," Wren said. "I've had 6 years to get used to that idea." Wexler studied her for one more moment, then extended a hand, formal, professional, a gesture that felt strange after a day like this one. "Good luck, Miss Sutherland, or whoever you actually are." Wren shook it, said nothing. There was nothing true left to say that wouldn't have cost more than it was worth. Holloway was waiting for her, by a black government sedan at the edge of the lot, out of earshot of the building, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has spent the last several hours rehearsing a conversation he still isn't ready to have. "Get in," he said. "Please." She almost refused on principle. 6 years of never getting into a car with anyone she hadn't personally vetted had built a reflex in her that didn't care how many stars were on a man's shoulder. But principle wasn't going to get her the truth. Only he could do that, and she'd waited 6 years too long to let pride slow her down now. She got in. He drove them off base, out past the perimeter checkpoints, along a 2-lane road that curved through pine woods, gone gold and rust with early autumn, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people carrying a weight too large to set down carelessly, each waiting for the other to choose the place. He chose a diner. Small, half-empty, the kind of roadside place with a laminated menu and a waitress who called everyone hon, tucked far enough off the main highway that nobody from the base would think to look for either of them there. He picked a booth in the back corner, facing the door, an old habit she recognized because it was hers too. "You want something to eat?" he asked, once they'd sat down. "I want the truth." "You're going to get both," he said. "Might as well eat while I tell it. Some of this takes a while." The waitress came. He ordered coffee for both of them without asking, and when it arrived, Wren noticed, almost against her will, that she drank hers hot for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Start with Winter Ferry," she said. "Start with what actually happened. Not the sanitized version. Not the version that made it into whatever file justified closing the case." Holloway wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into it for a long moment, like the coffee itself might give him the courage to begin. "The operation was compromised before your team ever left the staging area," he said finally. "We didn't know that at the time, we found out after. There was a leak in the chain somebody, with access to the extraction timeline, Who sold that information to the people your father's team was trying to get Lantern away from? By the time your father's element made contact at the safe house, the hostiles weren't reacting to an extraction in progress. They were waiting. An ambush. A trap, Holloway said. Set days in advance. Your father's team walked into ground that had already been prepared against them. Wren felt her jaw tighten, felt the old cold anger she'd spent 6 years learning to sit beside, instead of drown and start to rise again. Sharper now, given a shape it hadn't had before. You knew there was a leak. We suspected, Holloway said. Intelligence flagged irregular activity in the days before the operation. Communications that didn't track clean. I was briefed on the concern the morning of the mission. He looked up, and this time he didn't look away. And I authorized the extraction window anyway. The silence that followed was long enough that the waitress came by once, refilled both mugs without being asked, and retreated again without either of them acknowledging her. Why? Wren said. Just that. One word carrying 6 years of weight. Because Lantern's information was going to expose an operation 2 levels above Winter Ferry that would have gotten a great many more people killed if it collapsed, Holloway said. Because I made a calculation. A cold, ugly, career officer calculation, the kind they don't teach you how to live with afterward. That the value of what your father's team could extract outweighed the risk of proceeding into a compromised window. I told myself the odds were still in our favor. I told myself Naval Sutherland was the best sniper this program had ever trained, and if anyone could bring a team out of a bad situation clean, it was him. He didn't. No, Holloway said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that told her, more than anything else he'd said, that this confession had been sitting in him like a stone for 6 years, waiting for exactly this conversation. He didn't. 3 of the 4 extraction team members were killed at the safe house in the first 90 seconds of contact. Your father held the collapsing perimeter long enough for the 4th to get clear. By the time reinforcements reached the site, there was no body to recover. Not for your father. Not for the 2 hostiles that were confirmed neutralized in the firefight either. The whole site had been cleared before anyone with proper equipment made it in cleared. Sutherland, not just abandoned. Someone came back for something. Wren's hands had gone very still around her own mug. Or someone. Holloway didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped almost to nothing. We don't know. That's the honest truth. And it's the thing I have spent 6 years unable to say to anyone. Because saying it out loud makes it real in a way that's easier to live with when it stays classified. There was no confirmed kill. No body. No forensic trace conclusive enough to close the file the way we closed it. We closed it anyway. Because keeping an active search, running for a black program operator who might be dead, might be captured, might be compromised by hostile intelligence services, was a political and operational risk nobody above me was willing to keep carrying. So we wrote it as a loss. Killed in action, bodies unrecoverable, and I signed it. You signed a lie. I signed a decision, Holloway said, and for the first time since she'd known him 6 years of Tuesday morning coffee and Christmas card grins. There was nothing performed in his voice at all, the worst one of my career, and I have thought about it every single day since, Sutherland, whether you believe that or not. Wren sat with that for a long moment, turning her mug slowly on the table, watching the coffee ripple, feeling something in her chest that was too complicated to have a single name. Rage, yes, grief still always, but underneath both of those, something new and terrible, and impossible to put back in its box, now that it had gotten out, the cold, insistent, unbearable arithmetic of hope. If there was no body, if there was no confirmed kill, if someone had come back to that safe house for something or someone. You think he's alive, she said. Not a question this time. I think, Holloway said slowly, that 6 years of silence isn't proof of anything, except that whoever has the answer isn't interested in sharing it. And I think the men who tried to breach that arms locker today weren't looking for weapons. I think they were looking for you, which means somebody out there believes Iron Widow is worth the risk of a professional strike team on American soil. And I don't think a dead woman's ghost is worth that kind of exposure to anyone. Then who are they? Holloway exhaled slowly, and for a moment he looked every one of his 58 years, tired in a way rank couldn't fix. There's an organization we've been tracking for the better part of 2 years. Private military contractors. Off the books. Deniable the same way your old program was deniable, except operating for whoever pays instead of for a flag. We call them the Meridian Group internally. Though that's not a name they'd recognize, either everything about them is compartmentalized the same way everything about Winter Ferry was. They've been linked to at least 3 incidents in the last 18 months that all trace back, eventually, to assets and operators who went dark around the same window your father's team did. You think they were involved in Winter Ferry? I think, Holloway said, that the leak in our chain 6 years ago and the organization causing problems for half the intelligence community right now might be the same rot, grown a lot bigger in 6 years of nobody looking hard enough to cut it out. And I think whoever's running Meridian now either knows exactly what happened to your father's team or was part of making it happen. Wren sat back against the booth, and for the first time all day, all week, all 6 years, she let herself feel the full, dizzying scope of what she was being handed. Not just a name, not just a confession, a door cracked open after 6 years sealed shut, with something on the other side she had spent every night since Winter Ferry both praying for and dreading in equal measure. "I want in," she said. "Sutherland, I didn't ask for your opinion, Admiral. I said I want in. Whatever this is. Whatever you're building to go after Meridian. Whatever you know that you haven't told me yet. I want in. Starting now. And if you try to leave me sitting behind a desk, filing transport manifests, while somebody else goes looking for my father, I promise you, you will regret it far more than you regret Winter Ferry." Holloway looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, she realized. He'd expected this. Maybe he'd been counting on it, in the quiet, guilty way a man counts on the one thing that might finally let him make right on a debt he'd carried for 6 years. "There's a team," he said slowly. "What's left of one, anyway. 2 of your father's old contacts. People who worked adjacent to Cell 4, back when the program still existed. Both still active. Both still owed the truth same as you. I can reach out. Tonight if you want it. I want it. It won't be clean," Holloway said. "Whatever Meridian is building toward, and we don't fully know yet, that's the God's honest truth. It's bigger than one arms locker breach at a support base in Virginia. If they came for you today, it's because you represent a loose end in something they're actively protecting. Which means, the moment you step back into this, you're not disappearing again. Not until it's finished. I stopped disappearing 40 minutes after a fire alarm went off yesterday morning," Wren said. "There's no version of my life that goes back to filing paperwork now. You made sure of that the second you said my name out loud on a podium." Holloway had the grace, at least, to wince at that. "All right," he said quietly. "Then I'll make the calls tonight." And Sutherland, he hesitated, and for a moment, the careful, formal distance between them cracked, just slightly, into something almost human. "For whatever it's worth, I am sorry. Not because it fixes anything, because you deserve to hear it plainly, from the man who owes it to you, instead of finding it buried in a file somewhere." Wren looked at him for a long moment. 6 years of anger, of grief, of careful, disciplined silence, sitting across a diner table from the man who had signed the order that started all of it. "Save the apology," she said. "Buy me the answers instead. Then we'll talk about whether sorry means anything." She didn't go home that night. Couldn't. Home, such as it was, the beige apartment, the single photograph, the pistol under the mattress had belonged to a woman who no longer existed. A careful invention built to survive exactly the kind of ordinary Tuesday that had just ended 40 minutes ago in a diner, off Route 17. Instead, she drove, aimlessly at first, and then with growing purpose, out toward the coast, until she found a stretch of public beach access, mostly empty at this hour, wind picking up off the water, the last gray light of the day bleeding out over the horizon. She parked, walked down to the tide line, stood there with her boots sinking slightly into wet sand, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and let herself, for the first time in 6 years. Cry without checking first whether anyone was watching. It didn't last long. It never did. Not for her. Not since Ferry had taught her that grief was a resource to be rationed, not spent freely. But for those few minutes, standing alone on a darkening beach with the Atlantic breathing in and out in front of her like something enormous and patient, she let it out, the 6 years. The cold coffee, the small careful lies, the parade ground laughter that had cracked her whole careful world open in the space of a single sentence. Because you'll bury them all and walk away clean, her father had told her once, meaning it as a compliment. She hadn't buried them all. Not clean. Not ever, really, if she was honest with herself. She had simply learned to carry the weight without letting anyone see the shape of it. And now, impossibly, after 6 years of certainty dressed up as acceptance, there was a door standing open in front of her, and behind it, maybe, just maybe, the one thing she had told herself for 6 years she was never allowed to hope for again. She took her phone out, stared at Holloway's number, saved that afternoon, under a name that wasn't his real designation either, because old habits, even new ones, still knew to protect themselves. A text came through before she could decide whether to call. Team assembling. 2 names you'll recognize. First contact 700 tomorrow, off base, location secure. This is real, Sutherland. Whatever's coming, we're not doing it alone this time. She read it twice, then a third time, letting the words settle into the same cold, clear place inside her where her father's voice still lived, still counted her breaths, still reminded her, patient as frost, that the only kind of memory that never lied to you was the kind your hands carried without needing to be asked. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Somewhere out past the dark water, past the horizon she couldn't see, a door that had been closed for 6 years was standing open now, and whatever waited on the other side of it, her father, alive or otherwise, an organization built on the same rot that had killed her team, a truth 6 years buried and finally clawing its way back to the surface. She was not going to face it as a ghost anymore. She was going to face it as exactly what she had always been, underneath the beige carpet and the cold coffee and the careful, practiced smallness of a life built to be overlooked. Iron Widow. And this time, she thought, walking back up the beach toward her car with the wind at her back and the first hard edge of resolve settling into her spine like a spine of iron itself, this time, whoever came looking for her would find out exactly why her father had given her that name in the first place. Because a widow survives what should have killed her, and she does not apologize for it. She didn't sleep that night either, not really. But for the first time in 6 years, the sleeplessness had a different texture to it. Not grief circling the same worn groove. Not the low hum of waiting for a danger she couldn't name. Something closer to the hour before a mission, back when she was 21 and still learning the particular stillness her father called readiness. Not calm, not fear, but a kind of taut, focused clarity that made the whole world sharpen at the edges. She was at the address Holloway had sent by 640, 20 minutes early, because old habits didn't care that she'd spent 6 years pretending she didn't have them. It was a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Ashcombe, leased, she'd learn later, under a shell company name that led nowhere in particular if you didn't know exactly where to dig. Nothing about the building announced itself as anything other than what it appeared to be: gray brick, tinted windows, a parking lot half full of cars that could have belonged to anyone, which was, of course, the entire point. She badged in with a temporary credential. Holloway had couriered to her apartment sometime after midnight, rode a freight elevator up to the 3rd floor, and stepped out into a room that smelled like fresh coffee and old dust, folding tables arranged in a rough square, a whiteboard on one wall still bearing the ghost marks of a presentation someone had wiped down in a hurry. 2 people were already there. The first turned at the sound of the elevator, and Wren felt something in her chest catch, hard, before her mind even finished placing the face. Rosalind Marsh, the woman said. Before Wren could speak, a slow smile spreading across a face Wren hadn't seen in 6 years but would have recognized in complete darkness by voice alone. Late 30s now. A few more lines around the eyes than Wren remembered, a streak of silver threading through dark hair pulled back in the same practical braid she'd always worn. Same steady hands, same watchful stillness. The particular economy of movement that came from a decade spent diffusing things that were built to kill anyone who moved wrong. God, Sutherland, you got taller. I did not get taller. You got taller in my memory then, same thing. Marsh crossed the room and pulled her into a hug so sudden and so fierce that Wren felt something in her spine loosen. For the first time in 6 years, some old tension she hadn't fully realized she was still carrying. I thought you were dead. 6 years, Wren. 6 years I thought you were dead. I thought the same about you, Wren said, voice thick despite herself. Takes more than a bad Tuesday to put me down, Marsh said, pulling back, studying her face with an expression that mixed relief and something harder underneath it, something that looked, Wren realized, a great deal like fury, aimed somewhere else entirely. Holloway called me at 11 last night. I nearly hung up on him. Then he said your name, and she shook her head. I got in the car before he finished the sentence. The second person in the room hadn't moved yet, leaning against the far wall with arms crossed, watching the reunion with an expression that gave away almost nothing, which was, Wren remembered with a small jolt of recognition, exactly the point of him. Cole, she said. Elijah Cole straightened off the wall, and even now, even after 6 years, there was something in the way he moved that reminded her instantly of every early morning briefing she'd ever sat through with him, every long silent overwatch, every dry, understated joke he'd delivered in exactly the flat voice he was using now. Widow, he said. Just that, but there was more weight in the single word than most people managed in a full sentence, and Wren felt her throat tighten again, because Cole had been the 4th extraction team member, the one who made it out of that safe house alive. The one whose radio call, garbled and desperate, had been the last confirmed communication anyone had from that operation before the silence swallowed everything else. You made it out, Wren said. Nobody ever told me you made it out. Nobody told me you were still breathing either, Cole said. Funny how that works. 6 years, and neither of us knew the other one was still standing. He crossed the room, and, instead of a hug, he offered his hand, formal, steady, the same way he'd always done everything, and Wren shook it and felt the old, familiar calluses there, unchanged by 6 years of whatever quiet life he'd built for himself in the meantime. I've thought about that night every day since. About your father giving me the order to move while he held the line. I never got to thank him for it. Never got to tell anyone what actually happened down there, because by the time I made it to a hospital half-conscious, somebody already had a story ready for me to sign, and I was too far gone to argue. Wren felt the floor tilt slightly under that sentence. What story? Cole's jaw tightened. Same one you got, probably. Compromised extraction, Kea, unrecoverable. Except I was there, Wren. I saw your father go down covering our collapse. I did not see him die. There's a difference, and I have spent 6 years being told. Those two things are the same thing when every instinct I have says they're not. The room went quiet for a moment. 3 people who had each spent 6 years alone, with a version of the same unbearable uncertainty, finally standing in the same space to compare the shape of it. Holloway's briefing us at 700 sharp, Marsh said finally, breaking the silence with the brisk, practical tone Wren remembered from 100 pre-mission mornings. Full read-in on what they've got on Meridian. It's not much, from what I hear, but it's more than any of us had yesterday. Where is he? Wren asked. Running interference, Cole said. Apparently pulling a 2-star Admiral into a black program briefing room, without triggering about 6 different alarm bells up the chain took some doing. He'll be here. As if summoned, the elevator chimed again, and Holloway stepped out, dressed down now. No dress whites, no silver stars, just a plain gray jacket and the tired, wary posture of a man who hadn't slept much better than any of them. He nodded to Marsh and Cole, both of whom returned the gesture with a coolness that told Wren everything she needed to know about how the last 6 years had shaped their opinion of the man who'd signed the order that ended their old life. "Everyone's here," he said, setting a heavy case down on the folding table and popping the latches. "Then let's not waste the morning." He pulled out a laptop, a stack of printed files, and a satellite map already marked with a scattering of red pins across the eastern seaboard, and as he began to spread them across the table, Wren felt the last of her old careful, disappearing self settle fully into the ground, replaced by something that had been waiting 6 years to stand back up. "Before we start," Holloway said, looking up, meeting each of their eyes in turn, "I want to be honest about something. What we're building here isn't sanctioned. Not officially. I've got enough discretionary authority to stand this up quietly. For now, but if this goes sideways, there is no institution standing behind any of us. It's the 4 of us. Whatever intelligence I can pull without raising flags, and whatever Meridian is actually planning, which right now, I'll be honest, we don't fully understand. We've operated without institutional cover before," Marsh said flatly. "Turned out fine the last time too, didn't it?" Holloway didn't flinch from that, which Wren noted, quietly, as the first thing in 6 years that had made her trust him even slightly. "It didn't," he said. "And that's exactly why I'm not going to pretend this is safer. It isn't. But it's the only path I've got to finding out what actually happened to Daniel Sutherland, and to stopping whatever Meridian is building toward before it costs more people what it already cost your team." He pulled a single photograph from the file stack and set it in the center of the table, and Wren leaned forward, along with Marsh and Cole, to look. It was grainy, long lens, low light, the kind of image pulled from surveillance rather than posed for a camera. A man, mid-40s, perhaps, sharp, featured, standing at the edge of a dock, somewhere with cargo containers stacked behind him, looking off-camera at something out of frame, with an expression of total, unhurried control. "We don't have a confirmed name," Holloway said. "Internally, we've been calling him the architect because everything Meridian's done in the last 2 years has his fingerprints on the planning even when he's nowhere near the execution. What we do know is whoever he is, he has operational knowledge that lines up almost perfectly with programs that shouldn't exist outside a very small circle of people. Tactics. Timing. The kind of intelligence tradecraft that doesn't come from studying us. It comes from having been one of us." Wren stared at the photograph, at the sharp, unreadable set of the man's jaw, and felt something cold and certain settle into her stomach, the particular clarity that arrived. She remembered now. Right before her father used to say, "The range was hot." "You think he's connected to Winter Ferry," she said. "Not a question. I think," Holloway said quietly, "that whoever leaked our extraction timeline 6 years ago didn't stop working after that operation ended. I think they've spent 6 years building something a great deal larger than a single compromised mission. And I think the reason 2 operators showed up at Ashcombe with suppressed weapons the morning after I said, 'Your call sign out loud,' is because somewhere in that 6 years, this man learned that Iron Widow might still be alive, and decided that was a loose end worth the risk of exposure to eliminate." Cole picked up the photograph, studied it for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. "I don't recognize him," he said slowly, "but I recognize the setup. Dockside cargo operation. Private security detail just out of frame. Containers stacked for volume, not for show. That's not just an arms deal. That's logistics for something bigger. Something staged." "Staged for what?" Marsh asked. That, Holloway said, "is what we're going to find out. Starting today." He laid out the rest of it methodically. The pattern of incidents traced back to Meridian over the past 18 months. A series of small, deniable strikes that individually looked like isolated criminal activity, but together traced a shape too deliberate to be coincidence. The handful of known operatives connected to the organization, most of them former Black program assets, who had gone dark from legitimate service under circumstances nobody had ever fully explained. And, at the center of all of it, the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever the architect was building toward, the window Wren had walked through the day before her, call sign resurfacing, an attempted breach 40 minutes later, was not the beginning of something. It was a reaction, a course correction, forced by a mistake somewhere in Meridian's own operational security, one that had briefly, accidentally, let a 6-year-old ghost slip back into visibility. Which means, Wren said slowly, turning the thought over out loud as she worked through it, that whatever Meridian's building toward, it's close. Close enough that a single loose end showing up unexpectedly is worth the risk of an armed strike team on American soil, in broad daylight, on a Navy base. That's my read too, Holloway said grimly. Then we don't have 6 years this time, Cole said. We don't even have 6 weeks, probably. No, Holloway agreed. We don't. Wren looked around the table at Marsh, steady and furious, and finally, after 6 years, not alone in either feeling at Cole, quiet and precise, carrying a guilt about that safe house that mirrored her own in ways she was only beginning to understand. At Holloway, gray-faced and tired, and finally, for the first time in 6 years, telling the truth instead of managing it, and felt something settle into place inside her that had been missing since the moment a radio went silent on a frozen ridge line 6 years ago. Not peace, not yet. Maybe not for a long time still. But purpose. Sharp and cold and absolutely finally her own again. Then we'd better get started, she said, and reached for the file Holloway had set in front of her. The first page of 6 years of buried truth finally, terribly, beginning to surface. Because somewhere out there, Admiral, is a man who thinks Iron Widow died on a mountain 6 years ago. She looked up, and for the first time since a fire alarm had gone off, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of her mouth, thin, cold, and entirely without humor. He's about to find out exactly how wrong he was. Outside, 300 miles south, in a dockside warehouse office overlooking a stretch of Carolina coastline, where cargo containers stood stacked in rows too orderly to be anything but deliberate, a man with sharp features and an unhurried expression set down a secure phone and looked out through a rain-streaked window at the gray water beyond. "Report," he said, without turning around. The voice on the other end of the line was tight, clipped, careful in the way of a subordinate delivering news he already knew would not be welcomed. "Both operators are in custody. The extraction failed. Facility lockdown prevented. I asked for a report," the man said quietly. Not an excuse. A pause. "She's alive," the voice said finally. "And she's not what the file said. She took down 2 trained operators with office supplies in under 90 seconds. Whatever she was 6 years ago, sir, she never lost it." The man was silent for a long moment, watching a container ship crawl along the horizon, gray against a grayer sky. "No," he said at last, almost to himself. "I don't imagine she did." He set the phone down on the desk, unhurried, and reached, instead, for a single photograph tucked beneath a stack of shipping manifests, old, creased at one corner. A face he had studied more times in 6 years than he cared to admit, even to himself. A man in a ridgeline staging tent, rifle across his knees, looking up at whoever held the camera with an expression that had never once, in 6 years of captivity, given the man behind the desk anything close to what he wanted from it. "Move up the timeline," he said, without looking away from the photograph. "If Iron Widow is walking around again, then the people who trained her aren't far behind. We accelerate. Effective immediately." He set the photograph down, face up, beside the phone, and turned back to the window, to the gray water, to the ship crawling toward a horizon only he understood the significance of, and said nothing more at all. Because some debts, he had learned long ago, only ever came due in silence. And because 6 years was a long time to wait for a ghost to finally step back out into the light long enough to plan for every version of what might happen next, except, perhaps, for the one currently gathering itself around a folding table 300 miles to the north, cold-eyed and patient and no longer willing to stay buried. The rain kept falling on the water. The ship kept crawling toward the horizon, and somewhere beneath the calm of his expression, something old and careful and very nearly afraid began, for the first time in 6 years, to stir, because he had built his entire 6-year plan on a single, comfortable certainty that Iron Widow was dead, that Daniel Sutherland's daughter had gone into the ground, alongside every other loose end from Winter Ferry, silent and forgotten and safely erased from anyone's calculations. He had been wrong, and men like him, he knew better than anyone, did not survive being wrong for very long. Not in this business. Not ever. Not for 6 more years, and not for 6 more days either. Part 2, Winter Ferry. The briefing room went dark by 900. Blinds pulled, screens glowing, and for 6 hours nobody in it moved more than they had to. Because that was how this worked. Because grief didn't get scheduled around. Because the 4 of them had 6 years of unanswered questions crammed into one room and only a handful of days to answer as many as they could before Meridian moved again. Wren sat closest to the map. Old habit. Stay closest to the terrain, her father used to say. Everything else is noise until the terrain tells you different. Marsh worked the laptop. Cole worked the phone lines nobody official knew existed. Holloway worked the silence. Mostly, the particular silence of a man watching 3 people he'd wronged rebuild a version of trust out of pure necessity, because in necessity was the only thing left strong enough to hold it together. Here, Marsh said, around hour 4, spinning her screen around. Financial trail on the shell company that owns the Carolina dock facility. Buried under 4 holding companies, which took me 4 hours to peel back, which tells you something already. Tells you what? Cole said. Tells you whoever built this doesn't trust anyone enough to leave a clean signature. Not even their own people. Wren leaned in. Studied the corporate chain scrolling down the screen, name after false name, until one line near the bottom made her stomach go cold in a way 6 years hadn't dulled at all. That registration date, she said quietly. Marsh followed her finger. Went still. 6 weeks after Winter Ferry, Marsh said. Nobody spoke for a long moment, because that wasn't a coincidence. Because coincidences didn't build 4 shell companies in 6 weeks with the kind of precision this required. Because somebody had walked away from that frozen ridge line with money already moving, already laundering, already building something enormous out of the wreckage of 4 dead operators and 1 broken family. So whoever leaked our position, Cole said slowly, didn't just sell information. They funded a company with it. Or they were already building the company, Holloway said, and Winter Ferry was the down payment. Wren's jaw tightened. Because that was worse. Because that meant her father hadn't died in an ambush gone wrong. He'd died financing someone else's future. She stood, paced, needed her body to move, because her mind wouldn't sit still inside it anymore. I want a name, she said. We don't have one yet, Holloway said. Then get me closer to one. They got closer 3 days later, and it cost them almost everything. The lead came from Cole, an old contact, a former logistics coordinator who'd worked adjacent to black programs for a decade, and owed Cole a favor from a life neither of them talked about anymore. The contact gave up one name. A cargo manifest inspector at the Carolina port, mid-level, low security clearance, but positioned close enough to Meridian's shipping operation that he might know something useful. Might. That word did a lot of work in this business. Too much some nights. They planned the approach for 2 days. Careful. Deliberate. No direct contact from Wren. Her face was too much of a liability now, too recently seen by whoever Meridian had watching Ashcombe. Marsh would make contact instead, posing as a compliance auditor, a cover clean enough to survive a background check if anyone bothered to run one. It should have worked. Wren watched the operation unfold from a surveillance van, 3 blocks from the port entrance. Headset in, pulse steady, breathing counted in 4s out of habit rather than necessity. Marsh's voice came through clean, confident, exactly as rehearsed, until it wasn't. I've got company, Marsh said, voice dropping, and Wren felt every muscle in her body go rigid at the change in tone. 2 vehicles. Not port security, moving fast. Abort, Holloway said, already reaching for the radio. Marsh, abort now. Copy static. Then nothing. Then, 4 terrible seconds later, Marsh's voice again ragged, breathless, running. They knew I was coming, she said. Holloway. They knew before I even got out of the car. Wren's blood went to ice. Because there was only one way that happened. Because a cover that clean, built in 2 days, by 4 people in a locked room, didn't leak by accident. Because somebody inside their circle had talked. They got Marsh out. Barely. A hard extraction through a service gate. Cole had scouted as a contingency nobody had expected to need. Marsh diving into the back of the van with her cover blown and her hands shaking for the first time Wren had ever seen in the 6 years she'd known her. Talk to me, Wren said, gripping her shoulders. Are you hit? No, I'm not hit. Marsh's voice cracked, fury and adrenaline tangled together into something raw. But they had my description before I opened my mouth, Wren. My exact cover story, which means somebody handed it to them. Silence in the van. Heavy. Accusing. Because there were only 4 old people who'd known that cover story in full. Wren looked at Holloway, watched something in his face close off, guarded, and for one cold, terrible second she wondered. Actually wondered. God help her. Whether the man who'd signed her father's death warrant 6 years ago had just done it again. It wasn't me, Holloway said, reading the look correctly. I know how this looks. I know exactly how this looks. But it wasn't me. Then who? Cole said low. Dangerous. Because there's nobody else in that room, Holloway. Nobody else who knew. Holloway's hands tightened on the wheel. And for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face that Wren recognized instantly. Because she'd worn that same expression herself for 6 years. Fear. Not for himself. For someone else. There's one more person, he said quietly. My aide. Lieutenant Commander Reyes. He handles my secure communications. He would have had access to the operational file, even compartmentalized the way I built it. You gave a name to someone outside this van, Wren said, and her voice had gone very flat, very cold. I didn't give him details. Just logistics. Scheduling. Enough to keep my own calendar from raising questions. Holloway's jaw worked. I trusted him. I've trusted him for 3 years. Trust got my father killed, Wren said. Trust just got Marsh nearly killed too. So forgive me, Admiral, if I don't share your confidence. Nobody spoke the rest of the drive back. They confronted Reyes that night, in the same 3rd-floor office where the team had first assembled, and Wren watched the young officer's face when Holloway laid the timeline out flat on the table between them, watched for the flicker, the tell, the half-second of hesitation that separated an innocent man from a guilty one. She didn't have to watch long. I didn't have a choice, Reyes said, and his voice was already breaking before he finished the sentence, hands trembling against the table. They came to me 8 months ago. They knew things about my sister's medical debt that nobody should have known. They said all I had to do was pass along scheduling. Nothing operational, nothing that could get anyone hurt. Somebody almost died today, Cole said, quiet and lethal. I didn't know it would go that far. You never do, Wren said. That's how they get you. A little information, a little more, until one day you're the reason a body doesn't come home. Reyes's face went white. Who's your contact? Holloway said, and there was nothing left of the warm, podium-grinning Admiral in his voice now. Nothing but ice. Reyes gave them a name, a burner phone number, a dead-drop location behind a hardware store 2 counties over, and a description of a man he'd only ever seen once, in low light, sharp, featured, unhurried, giving instructions like he had all the time in the world and none of the fear a man should carry doing what he did. Wren felt something settle into place inside her chest. Cold. Certain the architect. Real now. Close now. No longer a grainy photograph and a working theory, but a man with a phone number and a habit of using frightened, indebted people as tools, the same way he'd apparently used a leak 6 years ago to end 4 lives on a frozen ridgeline and fund an empire out of the wreckage. We use it, she said. Wren Holloway started. We use the contact, she said again, harder now. We flip it. We feed him something he wants badly enough to show himself. And then, Admiral, we finally find out exactly who's been hiding behind 6 years of silence. Nobody argued with her. Not this time. Because they'd all seen, in the last 3 days, exactly how far this went. How close it had already come to costing one of them everything. And because somewhere out there, a man who thought Iron Widow had died on a mountain was about to learn, in the worst way possible, just how wrong that assumption had always been. The plan they built that night was reckless, dangerous. The kind of operation none of them would have signed off on 6 years ago, back when institutional cover still meant something, back when mistakes came with a safety net instead of a body count. But none of them had 6 years left to spend being careful. 24 hours, Holloway said, looking around the table at 3 faces that had already given this fight more than any of them should have had to give twice. That's what we've got before Reyes misses a scheduled check-in and Meridian realizes something's wrong. 24 hours to turn a scared kid's mistake into the first real advantage we've had since this started. Wren looked at the burner number written on the white board in Marsh's careful handwriting, at the dead drop location circled twice, at the grainy photograph of a man who'd built an empire on her father's blood, and felt the last soft edges of the woman who'd spent 6 years disappearing, behind cold coffee and quiet paperwork finally, to keep completely, burn away. Then let's not waste a single hour of it, she said. Outside the window, night had fully settled over the base, and somewhere south along a rain-slicked coastline, a man who believed himself 6 years ahead of every possible consequence was about to discover that the ghost he'd built his empire on top of had just picked up a phone. Part 3. Iron Widow 24 hours became 16. Because Reyes's contact called first. Because the architect didn't wait to be baited. Because men who build empires out of silence get nervous. The instant silence breaks somewhere they didn't authorize. The message came through the burner phone at 200, a location, a time, a single line of text that made Wren's blood go cold and hot at once. Bring the girl. We know she's yours now. Bring her, and we'll discuss terms for the old man. The old man. Wren read it 4 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to set the phone down. He's alive, she said. Not a question. A fact finally, after 6 years of not being allowed to say it out loud. My father is alive. Nobody in the room breathed for a moment. Wren, Holloway's voice. Careful. This could be a trap built entirely around that word. You understand that? I understand it, she said. I don't care. They didn't send her in blind. 6 years of discipline hadn't left her, even with hope clawing through her chest like something alive and unreasonable. Marsh built a route. Cole scouted approach angles on the abandoned processing plant, 20 miles inland from the Carolina Dock Meridian's fallback site. Chosen, they guessed, because a burned informant meant the port location was already compromised. Wren took position on a catwalk 200 meters out. Rifle borrowed from a case Holloway produced without explanation. The kind of weapon that shouldn't have existed inside a rental van but somehow did. Her hands remembered it instantly. Because muscle memory never lied. Because some things you didn't forget, no matter how many years you spent pretending otherwise. Below her, floodlights carved the plant floor into stark islands of light and shadow. Cargo containers stacked 3 high. Men moving with the loose, practiced confidence of people who didn't expect trouble tonight. And then, dragged between 2 guards, barely upright, a man with a beard grown wild and a face aged 20 years by 6 years of captivity. Her father. Wren's breath caught so hard it hurt, because she'd built a version of grief specifically shaped to survive never seeing that face again. And now here it was, alive, broken, breathing, and every careful wall she'd built around that grief came apart at once, all at the same time, all without permission. Focus, she told herself. Focus. You cannot help him by falling apart on a catwalk. 200 meters away, she breathed. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Her father's rhythm. Hers now. Always hers. The architect walked out from between 2 containers, like a man arriving fashionably late to his own party. Sharp-featured, unhurried, exactly as the photograph had promised. Except now there was a voice attached. calm and cultured and utterly without warmth. Iron Widow, he said, into the open air, toward the shadows where he clearly expected her to be. Or should I say Miss Sutherland? Your father talks about you, you know. Even after everything. Even now. Below her earpiece, Cole's voice, tight, Wren. We have eyes on 6 hostiles. Possibly more inside the containers. Copy, she breathed. He wanted you to run, the architect continued, pacing now, gesturing toward the broken man beside him, like a magician, revealing a trick. That was the whole point of Winter Ferry, wasn't it? Not the extraction. Not Lantern. Your father buying time so the rest of you could get clear. Right up until the moment I decided he was more useful to me alive than dead. Wren's finger found the trigger guard. Steadied. Her heartbeat slowed the way her father had taught her. That terrible discipline of stillness, in a moment built entirely for panic. Why, she said into the calm, quiet. For Holloway and Cole and Marsh alone. Why keep him alive 6 years? Leverage, Holloway answered, grim. A man like your father with what he knows about black program operations. That's not a hostage. That's an insurance policy. He wanted proof, Cole added. Proof the program was real. Proof he could use if anyone ever came looking. Below, the architect had stopped pacing, looked directly up at the catwalk as if he could see through 200 meters of darkness and steel by sheer force of certainty. I know you're up there, he called out. I know exactly what you're capable of. So let's not waste each other's time. Come down, and your father walks free. Stay hidden, and I put a bullet in him the moment my patience runs out, which, I promise you, is running very thin tonight, because that's how it goes, Wren thought, wild and fast and half a scream inside her own skull. Because you don't get the easy version, because nothing has ever once been easy, not since a radio went silent 6 years ago, and why would tonight be any different? Stop! Breathe! Focus! Wren, Holloway's voice low. Don't take the bait. That's an execution setup. The second you walk into open ground, you're a target with no cover. I know. So what's the plan? Wren studied the geometry below her. The angle from her position to the architect. The angle to her father, chained but upright, 40 feet to the architect's left. The 6 visible guards, spaced with careless confidence, men who'd never once had to consider that the woman they were baiting was already exactly where she wanted to be. The plan, she said quietly, is the same plan it's always been. The shot that took down the nearest guard came from an angle nobody expected, because Wren had never planned to stay on that catwalk. She'd used it as bait for exactly 90 seconds, enough to draw eyes upward, before dropping silently to a service ladder and repositioning through a maintenance corridor Cole had mapped 6 hours earlier. By the time the architect's men registered gunfire, she was already 40 feet from her original position, already moving, already doing the thing 6 years of stillness had never fully erased from her hands. Chaos below. Shouting return fire, aimed at a position she'd already abandoned. 2 down, Cole reported, moving from his own position now, laying suppressive fire to keep the remaining guards fractured. Marsh, go for the old man. Copy, Marsh's voice, breathless, already moving. Wren dropped into the plant floor through a side access door, rifle traded now for the pistol at her hip. Pipe. Because close quarters needed different tools, and her body already knew which tool belonged to which distance without her having to think about it. The architect had retreated behind a stack of containers, using her father as cover, one hand fisted in the older man's collar, the other holding a pistol against his temple. Stop, the architect said, and for the first time, his composure had a crack in it, thin but real. One more step and I finish what I started 6 years ago. Wren stopped, 10 feet away, close enough to see her father's face clearly. For the first time in 6 years, thinner, older, eyes hollowed by captivity but still, unmistakably, unbearably, his eyes. Wren, her father said, voice cracked from disuse. Don't you dare trade yourself for me. I mean it. His voice steadier now, finding some last reserve of the man who'd counted her breaths on a Sunday morning range a lifetime ago. You walk away from this. That's an order. I don't take orders from ghosts, Wren said, and something in her voice cracked despite every year of discipline holding it together. I thought you were dead. 6 years, Dad. 6 years I thought you were dead. I know, baby. His eyes filled. Despite everything, despite the gun at his temple, despite 6 years that should have burned every soft thing out of him and somehow hadn't. I know, and I am so sorry. But right now you listen to me the way you used to listen to me on that hill. You are not walking into a trade. You are going to do exactly what I trained you to do. The architect's grip tightened, touching, truly, but irrelevant. He looked at Wren, and something calculating moved behind his eyes. You have exactly 1 shot at this, Miss Sutherland. Assuming you're as good as the legend says. Assuming your hands haven't gone soft filing paperwork for 6 years. Test it, Wren said. Flat. Cold, certain. Because her hands hadn't gone soft. Because muscle memory never lied. Because every single night for 6 years, in the dark, alone, she had kept her hands ready for exactly this moment, without ever letting herself believe it would come. The shot broke a half-second later, not from Wren, but from behind the architect, where Cole had finally closed the angle he'd been working toward the entire fight, a single controlled round that took the architect's weapon hand before he'd fully registered a threat from that direction. The pistol clattered free. Her father dropped, rolling clear on instinct even after 6 years of captivity. And Wren closed the last 10 feet in under 2 seconds, driving the architect back against the container wall with a force that surprised even her, forearm at his throat. Every year of grief and rage and careful, patient waiting finally given somewhere to go. You killed 3 of my father's team, she said, voice shaking now, no longer trying to hide it. You built an empire on their blood. You kept my father in a cage for 6 years and called it insurance. I kept him alive, the architect rasped. That's more mercy than your government ever showed people like us. People like us, Wren repeated, disgusted. You think I was born wanting this? Something bitter twisted across his face, and for one strange, unwelcome moment, she saw a flicker of the man's own history there. A program that had used him too once, and discarded him the same cold way it had tried to discard her. I was an asset once. Just like you. Just like your father. Until the day I became inconvenient, and they decided my life was worth less than their secrets. So I built something they couldn't erase. Something with teeth. You could have built anything else, Wren said. You chose this. So did you, the architect said, and his voice had gone almost gentle now. Almost pleading, chose to become exactly what they made you. Iron Widow, a weapon with a pretty face they could point wherever they wanted. Tell me I'm wrong. For one terrible, suspended second, Wren hesitated, because there was truth buried somewhere in that ugliness, because 6 years of grief had made a weapon of her too, in its own quiet way. Except being made into something didn't mean staying that thing forever, she thought, fierce and sudden. Except the difference between him and her was simple, and it was everything. She'd never once chosen to build her pain into someone else's suffering. You're wrong, she said, quiet now, absolutely certain, because I didn't choose to hurt anyone who didn't come looking for it first. You did, every single time. Sirens in the distance now, Holloway's emergency call, federal backup finally converging on a location that had just gone from black site secret to very public crime scene. The architect's eyes flicked toward the sound, calculating, already searching for an exit that didn't exist anymore. Let him go, Wren said. Let this go. It's over. It's never over, the architect said. You'll learn that. Kill me, and someone else steps into the space I leave behind. That's how this always works. Maybe, Wren said. But it won't be you, and today that's enough. They took him alive. Federal agents, arriving in force 12 minutes later, found a scene already secured 6 Meridian operatives detained or down, 1 former black program prisoner, sitting on an overturned crate, wrapped in a jacket that wasn't his, and a woman kneeling beside him with both hands pressed against his face, like she was trying to memorize it before it could disappear again. You're really here, Naval Sutherland said, disbelieving, his hand shaking as it came up to cover hers. "You're really alive." "I'm really alive," Wren said, laughing and crying at once, the sound coming out broken and helpless in a way she hadn't allowed herself in 6 long years. "I thought, Dad, I thought you—" He pulled her into him, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything else at all, because some things didn't need words, because 6 years of silence finally breaking apart didn't require narration, only the simple, overwhelming fact of 2 heartbeats finally close enough to hear each other again. Holloway found them an hour later, sitting together on the back step of an ambulance, both wrapped in emergency blankets against the night chill, and he approached slowly, the careful approach of a man uncertain whether he was still welcome in this particular circle of relief. "Sutherland," he said quietly. "To the father this time, not the daughter. I owe you 6 years of explanations, and an apology that isn't going to be nearly enough." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then unexpectedly extended a hand. "You came for her," he said. "Eventually. That counts for something, Admiral. Not everything, but something." Holloway shook it, and something in his shoulders eased slightly. Some weight he'd been carrying since a frozen ridgeline 6 years ago finally, partially, set down. "I'm turning myself in," he said, "to both of them now. Formally. Full disclosure on Winter Ferry, the authorization, everything I signed and everything I buried. My career's over either way. Might as well make sure it ends with the truth instead of another cover-up." "That'll cost you everything," Wren said. "It already did," Holloway said quietly. 6 years ago. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until now." The weeks that followed moved strangely, the way time always moved after something enormous finally broke open. Debriefs. Federal interviews. A quiet, careful unwinding of Meridian's operations across 3 states, guided by intelligence pulled from servers. Cole and Marsh had seized before federal agents even arrived on scene. Holloway kept his word, resigned his commission within the month, faced an internal review that would likely end in something between disgrace and quiet prosecution, and did not once, in any of it, try to soften the truth of what he'd signed 6 years earlier. Wren's identity was restored, quietly, in the particular bureaucratic hush, reserved for things governments preferred nobody examined too closely. Iron Widow, no longer a ghost, no longer a punchline on a parade ground, reinstated with a designation that finally matched the woman who'd earned it. Her father needed months of recovery, physical and otherwise, and Wren gave him every single one of them without complaint, without hurry, relearning the particular rhythm of a relationship 6 years of silence had nearly erased. On a clear morning in late autumn, Wren stood at the edge of a quiet stretch of coastline, her father beside her, Marsh and Cole a respectful distance back, and read 4 names off a small brass plaque that had no official designation attached to it at all, just names, dates, and a single line beneath them that Wren herself had chosen. They did not disappear. "We remember them still." The wind off the water pulled at her hair, loose now, no longer pulled back tight enough to ache. Her father's hand found her shoulder, steady, present, real in a way she'd stopped letting herself hope for. "Your mother taught me something once," he said quietly. "About grief. She said you don't get over it, you just learn to carry it differently." "How do you carry 6 years of it?" Wren asked. "The same way you carry anything heavy," he said. "1 breath at a time. In for 4. Hold for 4, she finished, smiling despite the tears standing in her eyes. Out for 4. Hold for 4. They stood together in the quiet morning light, father and daughter, 6 years and a lifetime of grief, finally breathing the same rhythm again. And behind them, the tide came in slow and patient and endless, the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent to everything except the simple, unstoppable fact of moving forward, because that was the whole trick of surviving. Wren thought, watching the water reach for the shore and pull back again, over and over, patient as frost, patient as 6 long years of waiting. You didn't get over what should have killed you. You simply learned to walk on carrying it, And you did not apologize for still being alive to carry it at all.